He was just an old man in a tattered coat, accused of stealing soup. No lawyer fought for him, no family stood by, just silence. Until the courtroom doors flew open and a stranger stepped in, holding a letter that would stop everything. What that letter revealed, it changed everything and exposed a decades-long failure that left a war hero forgotten. If this moved you, type respect in the comments to honor those we overlook. The wind cut hard through the heart of downtown Chicago, rattling leaves and discarded receipts across the pavement like they, too, were searching for a place to rest. On a splintered bench outside an old transit station, a man sat hunched beneath a jacket too thin for the weather and too full of stories for anyone to guess. His name was Calvin Brooks, 71 years old, wrinkled hands like cracked riverbeds, skin weathered by more than just the cold. He didn't move much, just sat, shoulders bowed, as if gravity pulled harder on those who carried too many memories. A patch on his sleeve had once been an eagle with spread wings. Now it was just threads, faded, unraveling, ignored. He wore the jacket every day, even when the sun dared to shine. It wasn't warmth he clung to. It was identity. In his lap sat a paper tray with a few fries left over from a stranger's discarded lunch. He ate them slowly, like each bite was a ritual. Nearby, commuters rushed past. Suits and earbuds, coffee cups and leather shoes. They saw him, but not really. Eyes flicked and darted away, as if the act of seeing him might invite guilt they didn't have time to feel. He didn't ask for anything. That's what made him different. Other men on the streets held signs or called out for change. Calvin didn't. He didn't rattle cups or tell stories. He didn't explain. He simply existed, as if enduring was a kind of dignity all its own. A small dog walked past, tugging on a leash, barking at Calvin. The owner yanked the leash tighter and muttered something about vagrants. Calvin didn't flinch. He just stared ahead at nothing in particular, the kind of stare that comes from 1,000-yard past and no clear future. In his coat pocket, wrapped in plastic to shield it from rain and time, was a photograph. A black and white shot of a younger man in uniform standing beside a helicopter smiling. Next to him, a woman with kind eyes, his late wife, Lena. Calvin hadn't looked at it today. Not yet. There was something sacred about saving it for nights when the cold crept deepest. He adjusted the position of his battered boots, then resumed his silence. He wasn't waiting for a handout, wasn't hoping for a miracle. He was just waiting, because sometimes, when life has taken everything from you, all that's left is to hold still long enough to see if the world remembers you at all. The chime above the glass door jingled faintly as Calvin stepped into the warm, fluorescent glow of the neighborhood convenience store. The scent of overripe bananas, floor cleaner, and microwaved burritos clung to the air. He stood near the entrance for a moment, letting the warmth settle into his bones. His fingers, stiff from the cold, twitched slightly as he pulled his coat tighter around him. There weren't many customers, just a tired-looking teenager browsing the candy aisle and a man in a suit flipping through energy drinks. Behind the counter stood Mr. Abbasi, the owner, his eyes already narrowing when he spotted Calvin. They'd seen each other before. Calvin never caused trouble, but his presence still seemed to make people nervous, like a reminder of something they preferred not to think about. Calvin walked slowly to the soup aisle, the linoleum squeaking under his worn boots. He moved like a man older than his years, each step a quiet negotiation with knees that had once marched through jungle and desert but now ached even on dry pavement. He paused at the shelves. Chicken noodle, tomato, beef stew. He reached out for a can of chicken noodle soup, then let his hand hover. His stomach groaned, tight and hollow. On the bottom shelf, tucked between overstocked instant noodles, he saw a small protein bar. Probably expired. Still sealed. He looked over his shoulder. Mr. Abbasi was helping the suited man, ringing up cigarettes and lotto tickets. Calvin's hand moved quickly. The can of soup slipped inside his coat pocket. Then the bar. Just enough, he thought. Just enough to make it through the night without the sharp ache that had started to feel like part of him. But the new security mirror above the counter had caught it all. "Hey! Hey! Stop right there!" Mr. Abbasi's voice cracked through the store like a whip. The teenager dropped his candy. Calvin turned, but he didn't run. He didn't plead. He simply reached into his coat and pulled the can out slowly, placing it on the counter. "I was just hungry," he said, his voice quiet, nearly lost beneath the hum of the coolers. The owner was already on the phone, his words clipped and angry. Yes, he's still here. Yes, he tried to steal again. That old guy, yes, the one who hangs around outside sometimes. Calvin didn't move. He didn't argue. He just stood there. His head bowed slightly, his eyes fixed on the tile floor. 10 minutes later, 2 officers arrived. The younger one looked uncertain as he approached. "Sir, I need you to put your hands behind your back." Calvin nodded. "I understand." As the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, he winced, not from the pressure, but from the weight of recognition. Even after all these years, hunger was still a crime. The precinct lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile wash of white across the intake room. Calvin sat quietly on the hard bench, his wrists now free of the cuffs but marked red from their grip. He didn't speak unless spoken to, didn't ask questions. He'd been here before. Different precincts, same routine. The faces changed, the uniforms changed, but the process never did. An officer with a clipboard approached, sighing as he glanced down at the file. "Name? Calvin Brooks." The officer paused, looked up. "Middle name?" "James," Calvin replied. "Date of birth?" "November 9th, 1952. The officer typed it into the terminal, frowning as the screen flashed red. He tried again. The system blinked back. No known address, no known next of kin. VA status, unconfirmed. The officer glanced at Calvin. "You got any ID?" Calvin reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a worn leather wallet, the kind that used to hold snapshots and hope. He handed over a bent and faded VA card. The barcode was scratched, the corners peeling. The photo, barely visible, showed a younger man with tired eyes and a uniform. The officer scanned it. Nothing. "Looks like this thing hasn't been updated in a decade," he muttered. "You homeless?" Calvin nodded once. The fingerprinting came next. Ink pressed into ridges of skin hardened by time and cold. One print at a time, slow and deliberate. The machine processed them and blinked again. No outstanding warrants. Petty theft on record. Prior citations. Loitering, trespassing, nothing violent, nothing notable, nothing that mattered. Another officer leaned over the terminal. "That all we got on him?" The first officer shrugged. "Might as well be a ghost." Calvin sat back down, folding his hands in his lap. He stared at the wall, expressionless, as if he'd left his thoughts somewhere long ago and didn't bother retrieving them anymore. A door opened, and a young woman entered, tablet in hand. "I'm from the public defender's office. Brooks, Calvin?" He raised a hand slightly. She didn't sit down. She skimmed his paperwork, tapped her screen. "Misdemeanor theft. Judge Whitmore's docket tomorrow morning. You'll be arraigned, maybe assigned diversion if you're lucky. Don't expect too much. She's not big on leniency." Calvin said nothing. She paused. Do you have any medical conditions? PTSD, maybe? I served, he said simply. She didn't ask where or when, just tapped her tablet again. Okay, good luck. And with that, she left. Calvin looked around the booking room. The clock ticked louder than it needed to. Somewhere down the hallway, a man cursed through his cell bars. But here, in this waiting space between freedom and judgment, Calvin Brooks became what the system had always feared. A blank. A man with no paper trail, no voice loud enough to matter, no line of code that proved he'd once mattered to anyone. The hallway to the courtroom was cold. Not from the temperature, but from the silence that clung to its walls. The kind of silence that followed people like Calvin Brooks everywhere they went. 2 deputies flanked him, neither speaking as their boots echoed on the polished tile floor. Calvin shuffled between them, wrists bound once more, the cuffs biting softly into his thin skin. He kept his eyes down. Years ago, he'd learned there was safety in invisibility. At 71, even his bones moved slower. Every step toward the double doors ahead felt heavier than the last, not because of the physical weight, but because of what waited behind them. Another judge, another case file, another chance for the world to misunderstand him. When they pushed open the doors to courtroom 2B, no heads turned. No one whispered or paused, no cameras, no murmurs, just the usual rhythm of a courthouse morning. Clerks shuffling papers, a bailiff checking his watch, lawyers pacing, talking under their breath. There were no family members waiting on the benches, no friends, no one wondering what would happen to Calvin Brooks. The front row sat empty. A stray candy wrapper lay forgotten on the wooden floor. The public defender assigned to him leaned against the wall near the defense table, scrolling through her phone until she noticed the deputies leading Calvin in. She didn't smile, didn't greet him. Just glanced once at the clipboard under her arm, muttered, "That's him," and turned back toward the table without waiting. Calvin stood in place for a moment, unsure where to go until one of the deputies gently nudged him forward. His steps echoed in the hollow chamber, a sound that reminded him of a military barracks, orderly, uncaring. When he finally sat at the defense table, the wood felt smooth and foreign beneath his fingertips. His coat still carried the chill of last night's holding cell. Wrinkled, stained, and out of place. The judge hadn't looked up yet. She was flipping through files, her expression blank, unreadable. The prosecutor reviewed his notes without so much as a glance toward the defendant. To them, Calvin wasn't a man. He was an item on a docket. One more case to move along before lunch. He sat there, still and quiet, his face unreadable. The courtroom didn't notice him arrive. And, as far as anyone in that room was concerned, it wouldn't notice if he disappeared either. The people versus Calvin Brooks. The clerk's voice echoed across the courtroom with all the emotion of a vending machine. Calvin didn't flinch. He simply rose as the bailiff nudged his elbow. He stood slowly, hands at his sides, shoulders slightly stooped as if weighed down by something heavier than years. Judge Sarah Whitmore barely looked up from the case file in front of her. Her glasses sat low on her nose as she flipped through the pages. A former prosecutor herself, she had a reputation for being efficient, measured, some said. Others called it mechanical. Her bench was tidy, her tone clinical, her rulings swift. She glanced briefly at Calvin. Her eyes scanned the thin man in the fraying military coat, now hanging awkwardly on a frame, grown too lean. She returned to the file without comment. The prosecutor, a young man with perfectly parted hair and a tie too tight around his neck, stood. He cleared his throat with the eagerness of someone trying to make a name. "Your Honor, the defendant was apprehended for shoplifting a can of soup and a protein bar from a local convenience store. This is not his first offense." He turned a page in his folder. In the last 5 years alone, Mr. Brooks has been cited or arrested on 6 separate occasions for similar petty thefts, each involving food or over-the-counter medicine. He has no fixed address, no known employer, and no family on record. Due to his repeat offenses and transient status, the state requests denial of bail and recommends continued detention pending trial. Judge Whitmore tapped her pen twice against the bench. Calvin didn't move. He stood quietly, eyes low, as if he were waiting for rain that had already soaked him through. His public defender, seated beside him, barely glanced up. "No objections, Your Honor," she murmured, without meeting Calvin's eyes. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Brooks, do you understand the charges against you?" "Yes, Your Honor," Calvin said softly. His voice was steady, but worn, like pages turned too many times. "Do you wish to say anything at this time?" He looked up for the first time, not at the judge, not at the lawyers, but somewhere distant, past the walls, past the years. "I was hungry," he said simply. A few chuckles echoed from the back row, the kind of laughter reserved for people already written off. Judge Whitmore didn't smile. She returned to the file. Just another name. Just another charge. Case 10823. Theft by necessity. The system had a category for everything, even quiet hunger. "How do you plead, Mr. Brooks?" Judge Whitmore's voice was clear and direct, but not unkind. The words floated through the courtroom like routine. Sterile, practiced, the sort of question she asked dozens of times each day. Calvin didn't answer right away. He stood there at the defense table, hands folded in front of him, eyes resting on the wood grain as if it told a better story than anyone else in the room ever would. The silence stretched for a moment, just long enough to become noticeable. Then, quietly, he raised his head. "Guilty, Your Honor." His voice was soft, nearly swallowed by the rustle of papers and the shifting of shoes in pews, but it carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. "I was just hungry." For a beat, the room was still. Then came the sound from the back, one short, dry laugh, not loud, not long, just enough to slice the air. Someone in the gallery thought it was funny. Judge Whitmore's gaze lifted sharply, pinning the source with a glare that stopped any second laugh from following. Her face remained unreadable, but the cold edge in her eyes made it clear. She wasn't amused. Calvin didn't react. He'd heard laughter before, on sidewalks, in restaurants, from kids leaning out of cars. He'd learned long ago that people often laughed at what made them uncomfortable. Laughed when they didn't know what else to do with the truth. The prosecutor remained standing, eyes on his paperwork, pretending not to hear the judge's silence. The public defender shifted in her seat, already preparing to move on. But Judge Whitmore hadn't moved. She stared down at Calvin again, this time longer. Her eyes flicked once more to the file in front of her. Brooks, Calvin James, age 71. No fixed address. Prior offenses: petty theft, trespassing, loitering. Military veteran, unconfirmed. No dependents. No next of kin. There was nothing extraordinary in the file. Nothing to separate him from the dozens of other forgotten names that passed through her courtroom week after week. And yet something about the way he'd said it, "I was just hungry," seemed to echo louder than any closing argument she'd heard in years. It wasn't a defense. It wasn't even an excuse. It was just a fact, delivered without drama or expectation. Judge Whitmore set down her pen. Sometimes the quietest pleas were the ones that stayed with you longest. Judge Whitmore leaned back in her chair, ready to speak. One hand rested on the file before her, the other on the gavel. The bail hearing had already taken longer than most. In her mind, the path was clear. The defendant had admitted guilt. His record showed repeated petty offenses. No permanent address, no family, no reason to believe he wouldn't reoffend. It was routine. A sad routine, maybe, but a routine nonetheless. She opened her mouth to issue her ruling. That's when the courtroom doors creaked open. Everyone turned. Courtroom 2B wasn't a place where drama walked in uninvited, but in that moment, the heavy double doors parted just enough to let in a man. Tall, maybe in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and the urgent stride of someone who didn't belong there but knew he had to be. He wore a brown overcoat over a wrinkled button-down, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on the bench. In his hand was a weathered envelope, edges bent and softened by time. "Your Honor," he called out, louder than courtroom etiquette typically allowed. His voice cut through the silence like a blade, startling even the bailiff. Judge Whitmore's brows drew together. "This is a closed proceeding, sir. You'll need to—" "I'm sorry," the man said, quickly, breathless as he moved forward, past rows of confused onlookers. "But this can't wait. You need to read this, now." He held the envelope out with both hands, like it carried something fragile. For a moment, the courtroom seemed frozen, suspended in a kind of uncertain tension. The judge gave a curt nod to the bailiff, who stepped forward, took the envelope, and brought it up to the bench. Whitmore hesitated. This was highly irregular, inappropriate even, but there was something in the man's eyes, not desperation, but urgency born of conviction, the kind that didn't come from attention-seeking or theatrics. She took the envelope, slid one finger beneath the seal and pulled out a single page, typed and signed. There was also a photo inside, old, in black and white, edges yellowing. As her eyes scanned the document, her expression began to shift. First confusion, then stillness, then something else entirely. Across the room, Calvin stood silent, unmoving, watching the judge with a gaze that held no expectation. He didn't recognize the man. He didn't know what letter had just been handed over, but somehow he knew the moment was no longer routine. Something had cracked, and light, unfamiliar and uninvited, was starting to slip through. Judge Whitmore sat motionless for a long moment, the envelope now open before her, its contents resting in her hands like something sacred. The paper was thin but official, heavy with meaning even before a single word had been read. The letterhead bore the seal of the United States Department of Defense, faintly smudged at the top, as if it had been folded and unfolded too many times. Her thumb brushed over the embossed emblem. She glanced at the courtroom, the silence pressing in. The man who delivered the letter had stepped back, standing respectfully behind the last row of benches, his face tight with restraint, as though holding back something enormous. Calvin hadn't moved, still standing at the defense table with the quiet of someone long accustomed to being overlooked, even in moments that concerned him directly. With deliberate care, the judge unfolded the letter. To whom it may concern, it began. This letter serves as both testimony and record. The man currently before your court, Calvin James Brooks, is a decorated veteran of the United States Army. In 1971, during his second tour in Vietnam, he saved the lives of 4 members of a downed medevac crew, including my father, Major Benjamin Lowell, by extracting them under direct enemy fire and personally carrying the wounded to safety over nearly 2 miles of terrain. Her eyes scanned further. Staff Sergeant Brooks was awarded the Silver Star for his actions, though he never spoke of it publicly. After his discharge, he returned home to a country that failed to recognize what he had sacrificed. According to military records in 1986, due to a clerical failure during a system-wide file migration, his veteran benefits were discontinued and never reinstated. For nearly 4 decades, he has lived without medical support, without housing assistance, without recognition. Judge Whitmore paused, her throat tightening. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached back into the envelope and pulled out the photograph. It was grainy, but unmistakable. A younger version of the man standing before her now. Calvin Brooks, in full fatigues, one arm slung around the open door of a helicopter, a medic bag on his hip, the other hand resting on the shoulder of a bloodied soldier seated beside him. There was strength in his eyes, not the kind you boast about, but the kind that gets men through things others wouldn't survive. She looked up slowly, her gaze shifting between the photograph and the man in front of her. Calvin wasn't watching her. His eyes were fixed on the floor. But she saw him now. Not just the man who stood accused, not the homeless figure in a worn coat, but the soldier, the rescuer, the forgotten hero. And for the first time all morning, Judge Sarah Whitmore did not know what to say. The bench sat empty as Judge Sarah Whitmore stepped away, her robe trailing lightly behind her as she exited through the side door. The courtroom buzzed with low whispers, attention beginning to spread like fog through the rows of onlookers. But she heard none of it. Her steps quickened as she moved down the corridor and into her chambers, the door closing with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. Inside, the world felt smaller, quieter. A room built for judgment, now transformed into a space for reckoning. She lowered herself into the high-backed chair behind her desk, placed the letter gently on the blotter and stared at it again, as if seeing it for the first time. Major Benjamin Lowell, a name she recognized. Not personally, but with the faint ring of importance, like a war story told too many times to forget. The letter was dated just 2 weeks earlier, handwritten in careful script. Not typed this time. This one was personal. She began again, this time slower. My name is Major Benjamin Lowell, retired. I write to you on behalf of a man who never asked for recognition, never sought out parades or medals, and never once told his story, not even to the men whose lives he saved. That man is Staff Sergeant Calvin James Brooks. Her fingers lightly traced the edge of the paper, as though steadying herself. In March of 1971, my unit was ambushed during a medevac extraction near the Cambodian border. The helicopter took heavy fire. We crashed in dense jungle. Most of us were wounded. Enemy forces closed in fast. We radioed for help, but no one was nearby. No one except a supply unit with no orders to engage. Calvin Brooks defied those orders. Judge Whitmore felt her breath catch. He drove a jeep through live fire, carrying only a sidearm and a stubborn refusal to leave us behind. He pulled me from the wreckage with 2 broken ribs of his own. When the rescue team finally arrived hours later, we were all still breathing because of him. The judge leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes. She had sentenced hundreds of men in her time on the bench. Some hardened, some lost. Some unlucky, but none like this. The photo still rested beside the letter, that ghost of a younger man staring back at her from across time. A soldier with strength in his posture and mercy in his eyes, and now that same man stood alone in her courtroom, charged with stealing soup. She opened her eyes, folded the letter once more with great care. Something inside her had shifted. Not pity, not shock, recognition. The soft scratch of paper against her fingertips was the only sound in the judge's chambers as she turned the page. The second half of the letter was heavier, not in weight, but in what it carried. Major Lowell had written the facts with a soldier's discipline, but there was sorrow between every line. After the jungle and the blood and the orders barked under fire, Calvin Brooks had come home to a different kind of battlefield, one he was never trained to fight. When Calvin returned stateside in late 1971, The letter read, he found the world he'd left behind no longer waiting for him. His wife, Lillian, had fallen ill in his absence. She passed before he ever made it back to Chicago. There was no funeral to attend, only a letter and an empty apartment. Judge Whitmore exhaled slowly. The apartment, once theirs, had already been repossessed. With no family nearby and no legal support, Calvin was left adrift. He applied for benefits, but a clerical error at the VA marked him as inactive, then deceased. His case file was misplaced during a digital records transfer in 1986. From that point on, Calvin Brooks ceased to exist in the system he had served. She stopped reading for a moment, her eyes lifting to the window, though there was nothing outside but gray Chicago sky. Calvin hadn't just fallen through the cracks. The floor had vanished beneath him. He tried for a time to get help. He wrote letters. He waited in VA offices. He showed up for appointments that were never honored. Eventually, he gave up. Not out of weakness, but out of exhaustion. The government that trained him to fight had no protocol for saving him afterward. Her eyes returned to the page. I found out about Calvin's story only recently, from another member of our old unit who thought he saw him on a street corner. We confirmed it was him. Older, gaunter, still wearing pieces of his uniform like armor no one could take from him. When I reached out, he wouldn't take money. He wouldn't even let me buy him a meal. All he said was, "It's too late for me, Ben. Just make sure someone sees the next guy." Judge Whitmore set the letter down and covered her face with one hand. It wasn't just a letter anymore. It was an indictment. Not of Calvin Brooks, but of everything that had failed him. A man who once carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire had come home only to be lost in a pile of paperwork. And somehow, no one had gone looking for him. Until now. Judge Whitmore sat with the phone pressed against her ear, her hand gripping the receiver tightly as the line crackled in her quiet chambers. She had requested a direct call to a senior administrator at the Department of Veterans Affairs, something not easily granted, even to a sitting judge. The system didn't move for emotion. It moved for protocol, and even then, only when it was forced. "Judge Sarah Whitmore, Cook County," she repeated for the third time. "Yes, I'm calling regarding a veteran, Calvin James Brooks. Social Security number ending in 2297. I need verification of his benefits status, or lack thereof." There was a pause, a few keystrokes in the background. "I'm seeing a... Hold on," the voice on the other end said, suddenly uncertain. More typing, a longer pause. "Strange. There's a flag here from years ago. Looks like his file was marked for review during a system transition in, 1985? Whitmore straightened in her chair. "What kind of transition?" "VA database overhaul," the man replied, now sounding uncomfortable. "Paper to digital. Some files were miscategorized. A few were lost. His must have been one of them." "Lost?" she repeated, her voice colder. "Well, not lost exactly. More like buried. If no one followed up, if he didn't respond to a verification notice mailed to his last known address, he'd be marked inactive. Possibly even deceased, depending on the error code. Was he ever reinstated? No, ma'am. According to this, he's been ineligible for benefits since 1986. But based on his service record, this man should have been receiving pension, housing assistance, medical care. He's owed quite a lot." "How much?" A few more clicks, then silence. "Adjusted for inflation, missed payments, retroactive eligibility, it's over $300,000. The number hung in the air like smoke. "Can you send me that file?" she asked, though she already knew what the answer would be. "We're not supposed to, but I'll email a redacted summary. You didn't hear that from me." The call ended. Whitmore stared at her reflection in the darkened window of her chambers. A man had come home from war and disappeared, not by choice, but by design. By a machine too large to notice its own mistakes. It wasn't malice. It was something colder. Indifference wrapped in procedure. Calvin Brooks hadn't been denied help because of who he was. He'd been denied because somewhere in a beige folder 3 decades ago, a box hadn't been checked. And no one looked again. When the courtroom reconvened, it did so with the same mechanical rhythm as before. The bailiff called the room to order. The prosecutor flipped through his notes, assuming they'd be picking up right where they left off. The public defender tapped her pen against her notepad, still not having bothered to ask her client anything beyond his name. Calvin Brooks was led back into the room by the deputy. Same coat, same quiet posture, same distant look in his eyes. But something had changed, though he couldn't quite name it. He felt it in the air, a shift too subtle to grasp, like the first few drops of rain before a storm. He sat at the defense table, unaware that his file now rested open in front of a judge who had read every word and felt every silence between them. Judge Sarah Whitmore adjusted her robe, folded her hands, and looked directly at the man she had nearly condemned just an hour earlier. No longer was she simply reading a case number from a docket. Now she was seeing a person, a veteran, a husband, a survivor. She cleared her throat. The courtroom quieted. "Mr. Brooks," she said, her voice no longer procedural, "I believe you were never meant to stand here like this." Calvin blinked slowly, uncertain if he'd heard correctly. He turned his head slightly, like he wasn't sure the words were meant for him. "I've reviewed new information that was brought to this court's attention," she continued, her voice measured but warmer now. "Information that changes the context of this case significantly." He stared at her with a guarded expression. Life had taught him not to expect understanding from people in robes. He'd seen too many doors closed, too many hands pulled back just before they reached him. "I understand you served in Vietnam," the judge said, "and that, due to a clerical error, you were denied the benefits you rightfully earned. For decades." There was a beat of silence. The courtroom wasn't sure what it was witnessing yet, but something had cracked open. Calvin's lips parted slightly. He didn't nod, he didn't speak. He simply looked at her, not with hope, but with a tired kind of curiosity, as if to ask why now. And though the judge couldn't say it aloud, the truth lingered in her eyes. "Because someone finally looked closely enough to see you." A murmur stirred in the courtroom as the man in the brown coat slowly stepped forward from the back row. He moved with the awkwardness of someone uncertain whether he belonged, but determined to speak anyway. His hands were clasped in front of him, the same envelope he'd delivered now folded neatly in his coat pocket. He glanced once toward Calvin, then up at the judge, eyes full of something too layered to name. Respect, grief, purpose. Judge Whitmore gave a slight nod. "State your name for the record." "Derek Lowell," he said, his voice steady but soft. "I'm the son of Major Benjamin Lowell, U.S. Army, retired." There was a pause, and then something else in his voice, something personal. "My father passed away 3 weeks ago. Cancer. He spent the last few years of his life searching for someone he thought he'd never find again." He turned slightly to look at Calvin, who remained seated, still trying to understand what all this had to do with him. Derek continued. "That person was Staff Sergeant Calvin Brooks. My dad never forgot what happened in Vietnam. He talked about it often, about how his medevac team had gone down in the jungle, about how he'd thought they were all going to die." He swallowed hard. And then someone showed up. Alone, no orders, no backup. Just a man who wouldn't let them die out there. The courtroom was silent now. Even the prosecutor, who'd been checking his watch minutes earlier, had lowered his hands and listened. My dad used to say that he owed every breath he took after that day to the man who carried him out of that jungle. He only ever knew him as Brooks. He said he barely saw his face, just felt arms lift him, drag him through mud, through gunfire. He said he kept slipping in and out of consciousness, but each time he woke, he heard the same voice telling him, "Just keep breathing." Derek looked at Calvin again. It haunted him, not knowing what happened to that man. He thought maybe he'd died too. But 2 months ago, an old army buddy called him and said he saw someone sitting outside a gas station in Chicago, wearing the same eyes from 50 years ago. That was you. Calvin didn't speak. He couldn't. His hands were resting still in his lap, but his throat worked as he swallowed, slow and deliberate. He stared at Derek as if seeing a ghost, or maybe just a piece of himself long buried. "My father's dying wish," Derek finished, voice cracking slightly, "was to find you, to say thank you, and to make sure the world remembered who you really were." The silence that followed Derek Lowell's final words was heavy, but it didn't last. A soft gasp escaped from somewhere in the gallery, followed by a louder one from the second row. Then the sound of pens scratching across notepads. Reporters, who had barely looked up before, were suddenly wide-eyed, taking frantic notes, their pens racing to catch what no one could have expected when the day began. Even the hum of the courthouse HVAC system seemed quieter now, as if the room itself was holding its breath. At the prosecution table, the young assistant district attorney shifted uncomfortably. His tie suddenly felt tighter. He looked down at the case file that had once seemed so straightforward, just another homeless man stealing food, and realized how little it had ever told him, how little he had bothered to ask. He cleared his throat but didn't speak. What could he say? That the state regretted its oversight? That they'd missed the war hero hiding in plain sight? That a man who'd once carried others through hell was now being charged for the price of a soup can? At the defense table, something strange happened. The public defender, who had barely glanced at her client since their brief meeting in the holding cell, turned her chair toward him. She studied his face. Really looked. It was as if she were seeing him for the first time. The wrinkles around Calvin's eyes, deep and deliberate like the creases of a folded flag. The calluses on his hands that told stories no file ever could. The set of his shoulders, not proud but enduring. The quiet in him that wasn't weakness but restraint. A man who had seen more than most and asked for less than any. She opened her mouth, maybe to apologize, maybe to offer something more than indifference. But no words came. She simply lowered her gaze, ashamed of the part she'd played in the ritual of dismissal. In the back, someone whispered, "Did you hear what he did? Saved a whole crew in Vietnam. Carried them out under fire." More murmurs spread, like the truth blooming in slow waves. The courtroom, which moments ago had regarded Calvin Brooks as another case on the docket, now looked at him differently. Not with pity, but with a growing realization that they'd all missed something sacred. And through it all, Calvin sat still. Not because he didn't feel it, but because part of him couldn't believe it. Judge Whitmore sat quietly for a moment longer, her fingertips resting on the edge of the bench, eyes lingering on Calvin Brooks. The file before her, once an empty summary of trespasses and missed court dates, now felt like a hollow shell, a shadow of a life that had never been fully documented, never properly understood. She reached for her gavel but didn't strike it. Not yet. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but unshakably firm. The court recognizes that Mr. Brooks has suffered a profound and long-standing miscarriage of justice, one not limited to this courtroom, but rooted in the failure of multiple institutions to honor the service he gave to this country. A hush fell again. "The charges against Mr. Brooks are hereby dismissed," she said clearly, her voice ringing through the room. "With prejudice." A few audible gasps met the statement. The words meant the case was closed, permanently. It could not be reopened, not by the prosecutor, not by the state. Calvin Brooks would not be tried again for stealing soup to survive. Judge Whitmore wasn't finished. "In addition," she continued, flipping to a fresh page on her notepad, "this court is ordering an immediate formal hearing to correct and reinstate Mr. Brooks's Department of Veterans Affairs records. All necessary documentation from Major Benjamin Lowell and corroborating military sources will be submitted for review within 72 hours. She looked at the clerk and spoke with quiet authority. "Notify the VA liaison assigned to the Cook County Circuit. I want Mr. Brooks's file prioritized, effective immediately." The clerk nodded without hesitation, already scribbling. Judge Whitmore turned back to Calvin. "Mr. Brooks, arrangements will also be made for a comprehensive medical evaluation and safe housing. You are not to return to the streets. Not now. Not ever again." Calvin blinked slowly. For a moment it looked as though he might say something, but his lips never parted. His hands remained folded in his lap. There was no dramatic reaction, no weeping, no raised fists of victory. Just a quiet man sitting still, as if afraid that moving too quickly might wake him from whatever dream this was. He had been reduced to a ghost by a clerical error, erased not by malice but by neglect. And now, for the first time in decades, someone had rewritten his name into the record, properly, permanently. The courtroom didn't erupt in applause. But for the first time that day, Calvin Brooks was no longer invisible. The story traveled faster than anyone expected. What had begun as a routine misdemeanor hearing became a headline by nightfall. "Vietnam veteran cleared of charges after courtroom revelation." The photo accompanying the story showed Calvin in his tattered coat, seated beside a uniformed stranger, Derek Lowell, who stood like a sentinel beside him, one hand on his shoulder. Veterans groups across the country responded first. Some were furious, others heartbroken. But all of them moved. Calls were made. Forums lit up. A handful of older vets remembered the name Brooks from training rosters, old unit logs, stories told late at night over drinks and smokes when the ghosts wouldn't let them sleep. By morning, donations had begun pouring in, not just from military organizations, but from ordinary people who saw in Calvin something that struck too close to home. A father, a neighbor, a man who had once been everything and then became nothing because the system failed to remember. One anonymous donation came with a simple note. He carried others. Now it's our turn to carry him. A local shelter, once barely hanging on with grant money and second-hand blankets, offered Calvin a room immediately. But Judge Whitmore had already arranged something more stable. Through a fast-tracked city program, an apartment was secured in a low-rise building for senior veterans. The bed was clean. The sheets smelled of laundry soap. There was a small kitchenette and a dresser with working drawers. That first night, when the door closed behind him, Calvin stood for a long time in the center of the room, unsure what to do with the silence. Not the kind he was used to, the cold, aching kind that came with sleeping under overpasses, but something softer, something unfamiliar. He sat on the edge of the bed and slowly untied his boots. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't have to keep one foot on the ground, just in case someone came. He took the photograph of Lillian out of his coat pocket and placed it on the nightstand. "We made it," he whispered. That night, he slept for 8 hours straight. No sirens, no shouts, no biting wind clawing at his ribs. Just the steady, quiet rhythm of a man finally at peace, held not by concrete and cardboard, but by walls that would not forget him. The rotunda at City Hall was full. Press, veterans, city officials, and strangers who had only just learned Calvin Brooks's name but felt like they'd known him forever. The marble floors echoed with the low hum of conversation, reporters murmuring over their notes, cameras clicking softly as they adjusted focus. At the front of the room stood a podium draped in red, white, and blue, flanked by flags and 2 servicemen in formal dress. Behind them, seated in a place of quiet prominence, was Calvin. But he wasn't in the old threadbare coat anymore. He wore a new uniform, one tailored to fit, its crisp lines honoring what his body had once endured. On his chest, gleaming under the high domed ceiling, were medals he'd earned decades ago, finally returned to him. The Silver Star, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart. And today, a belated Medal of Honor commendation, awarded by the state for extraordinary heroism. The judge was there, standing beside Derek Lowell, who had helped press the case forward through every step. Calvin's public defender, looking smaller somehow in the crowd, clapped quietly from the second row. The mayor approached the podium with a solemn expression, pausing to adjust the microphone. "Today," she said, "we honor a man who did not ask to be remembered, who never sought attention, and who carried more than his share of burdens. Calvin Brooks is not just a war hero. He is a reminder of what we lose when we forget to look deeper, and who we fail when bureaucracy speaks louder than compassion." Applause followed, not the polite kind, but the kind that builds from somewhere deeper. Then the mayor turned, lifting a small bronze key from a velvet box. "On behalf of the city of Chicago, it is my privilege to present you with this, our key to the city, for service, for sacrifice, for reminding us all of our duty to each other." Calvin stepped forward slowly. His hands trembled as he accepted the key. He blinked against the camera flashes, clearing his throat. "I don't know what to say," he began, voice wavering. "For a long time, I thought I'd been erased, not just from the records, but from the world." He looked up, eyes glistening. "I didn't come back to be honored. I came back and disappeared. But somehow, you found me. You remembered." And in that moment, the city stood still, not in pity, but in reverence. The letter appeared online the following morning. Someone from the courthouse, no one ever said who, had scanned the original and shared it on a small veteran advocacy blog. It wasn't a flashy post, no headline shouting for clicks, just a quiet caption that read, "The letter that changed everything." But within hours, it began to spread. Major Benjamin Lowell's handwriting, crisp and deliberate, told the story that no headline could. It spoke of jungle heat, of bullets whizzing through trees, of the medevac crash, and of the man who came without orders, without armor, without hesitation. The letter described Calvin Brooks not as a legend or a myth, but as something more powerful, a man who did the right thing when no one was watching. By noon, it had gone viral. News outlets picked it up first, then the military forums, then the social media accounts of people who'd never served a day in uniform but felt the ache of what had been missed. Comment sections filled with stories from family members, sons and daughters of veterans, caretakers of the forgotten. Photos were posted, old newspaper clippings, mentions of men and women who'd slipped through cracks no one had ever sealed. The letter didn't spark outrage the way scandals usually did. It sparked reflection, a quiet reckoning, People asked questions. How many Calvins were still out there, buried beneath paperwork and silence? How many were sitting on park benches in plain sight, carrying memories too heavy to speak, and names no longer tied to anything official? One tweet read, "He saved a life in war, then got forgotten in peace. How many more have we walked past?" It was shared over 80,000 times in a single day. The VA issued a formal statement within 48 hours, acknowledging a need to re-examine veteran records from before the digital transition. Petitions launched overnight, demanding a nationwide audit of lost benefits. But somewhere in a small apartment in Chicago, Calvin Brooks didn't know about any of that just yet. He was sitting at his kitchen table with a mug of coffee, the steam curling up toward the ceiling. He didn't have a smartphone. The television was turned off. In front of him lay a copy of the letter printed neatly on crisp white paper. He ran a finger over the words, remembering the voice behind them. "Just keep breathing," it had once told him. And now, decades later, the world was finally breathing with him. The pressure came swiftly, not from a single voice but from thousands swelling into one. Letters poured into congressional offices, handwritten and typed, some from veterans, others from family members who had long suspected that something had gone wrong but never had the proof. Now, with Calvin Brooks's story laid bare before the nation, there was no more room for silence. The Department of Veterans Affairs issued a statement filled with the language of institutions. Deeply regrettable, internal review underway, committed to correction. But people weren't interested in apologies. They wanted change. Within weeks, the VA initiated what it called a comprehensive audit of historical records. Boxes of files were pulled from dusty archives, many of them untouched since the 1970s and 80s. Cases flagged as inactive, deceased, or ineligible were re-examined. It quickly became clear that Calvin Brooks had not been an anomaly. He had been a symptom. Thousands of veterans were identified across the country. Men and women whose service had been honorable, but whose benefits had vanished because of outdated systems, misrouted mail, or data errors never corrected. Some were found living in shelters. Others were in hospitals, their paperwork stuck in limbo. A few had passed on, their families unaware that pensions or health coverage had ever been owed to them. The headlines shifted. What began as a human interest story became something larger, a public accounting. Government hearings were convened. Retired officials were questioned under oath. Families gave testimony in packed rooms, holding up photos of their loved ones beside returned medals and folded flags. Out of this reckoning came a bipartisan effort in Congress. For once, the politics didn't split along party lines. Everyone could agree that the country owed more to those who had worn its uniform. They called it the Brooks Act. The legislation proposed mandatory audits of all veteran records before 2000, streamlined appeals for lost benefits, and the creation of a permanent division tasked with locating veterans who had gone missing from the system. It also established funding for emergency housing and legal assistance, so that no veteran would have to stand alone in court the way Calvin had. The bill passed the House unanimously, then the Senate. And still, Calvin Brooks stayed quiet. He didn't give interviews, didn't attend hearings. But when a staffer from the VA called to tell him that 5 more veterans in Illinois had just been reinstated because of the audit, he only said, "Good, keep going." The system had put him on trial for surviving. Now, at last, the system itself was on trial for forgetting. At first, Calvin said no. When the invitation came from a local high school, delivered in a neatly typed letter with polite enthusiasm, he folded it carefully and placed it on his kitchen table beside his morning coffee. It sat there for 2 days. He wasn't a speaker. He wasn't polished. What could he possibly say to a room full of kids who lived in a world that barely remembered the one he came from? But on the third morning, he looked at Lillian's photo on the windowsill and thought, maybe someone needs to hear it. So he called them back and said yes. The first visit was quiet, uncertain. He stood in the back of a classroom, hands clasped behind his back, wearing a clean shirt and the same old eyes. The students didn't know what to make of him at first. He wasn't loud, didn't come with flashy presentations or medals hanging from his chest. He just stood there and began with, "My name's Calvin Brooks. I served in Vietnam. I came home and disappeared for 40 years. That got their attention." He didn't speak with fire or fury. He didn't dramatize his suffering. He simply told the truth. About the jungle, about the medevac crew, about the system that lost him, about sleeping on sidewalks, about whispering goodnight to a photo in his coat pocket, and about how one day in court someone finally decided to look at him instead of past him. He visited another school the week after, then a veteran center on the south side, then a community college. Soon, the invitations kept coming. At each stop, he told the same story, but it never grew rehearsed. The students listened, quietly, eyes wide, sometimes stunned. Afterward, a few always stayed behind. One girl waited to tell him about her grandfather, who stopped speaking after coming home from Iraq. A teenage boy said he'd never known that veterans could end up on the street. "I thought that only happened in movies," he admitted. Calvin never scolded. He never preached. He only told them what silence can cost, how dignity doesn't come from titles, and how anyone, no matter how forgotten, can still matter. He walked into each building alone, but left carrying the weight of 100 small awakenings. And for the first time in his life, his voice, the one buried for decades under silence and snow, was finally being heard. It was a simple wooden bench tucked beneath the old sycamore tree outside the courthouse entrance. It had always been there, weathered by years of sun, rain, and footsteps passing by without pause. Most people never noticed it. Calvin had, many times. It was where he'd waited before hearings, before the shelters opened, before he knew if he'd find warmth that night or just another corner of the city to vanish into. Now, the bench bore a new presence. The wood had been sanded and sealed, the slats repaired, and on the center plank, newly engraved in bronze, were the words, "Here sat a man the world forgot, until it chose to remember." There was no crowd the morning the plaque was revealed. No ribbon cutting, just a small gathering of people who knew what the words meant. Judge Whitmore stood quietly at the edge, her hands folded in front of her. Derek Lowell was there too, a hand resting over his chest as he read the inscription. A few court clerks, some veterans, a boy who had once offered Calvin a sandwich outside a gas station and never forgot the way he said thank you, like it was the last word he had left. Calvin didn't make a speech. He just stood before the bench, one hand trailing gently over the polished wood, the other holding his worn VA cap by his side. His coat was new, but the posture was the same, modest, unassuming, as if unsure he belonged at the center of anything. He finally sat down, slowly, as if returning to an old ritual. The courthouse loomed behind him, the city bustled in front of him. But here, in this small space between justice and memory, something felt still, honest, seen. Children walked past on their way to school, some glancing curiously, others tugging at their parents' hands to pause and read the plaque. One little girl turned and asked, "Who was he?" Her mother answered softly, "A hero." And for once that word didn't feel distant or wrapped in mythology. It felt real, human. Calvin didn't need fanfare. He didn't ask to be honored. But now, The place where he once sat in silence would speak for him every day. He had once waited here as a number. Now, he would be remembered by name. It was late afternoon when the student approached the bench. The air was crisp, touched by the scent of fallen leaves and the quiet hum of traffic drifting from the street. She moved slowly, clutching a small bouquet of white daisies wrapped in brown paper, the kind you buy from the corner bodega when words feel too small. Her backpack was slung over one shoulder, her fingers ink-stained from class notes. She looked no different than any other young person passing through the city, except she wasn't just passing, she was searching. The bench stood exactly where it always had, under the wide arms of the sycamore tree that had outlived protests, parades, and too many quiet exits. Its bronze plaque still gleamed in the sun, though the edges had dulled slightly with time. She read the words again, even though she'd memorized them long ago. Here sat a man the world forgot, until it chose to remember. The girl knelt, placed the flowers gently on the wood, and brushed a leaf away from the base. Then she whispered, so softly only the breeze could carry it, "Thank you." She wasn't sure why the tears came. Maybe it was the weight of the story, or maybe because she knew how easily someone could disappear, and how rarely the world chose to look back. She had read about Calvin Brooks in her high school history book. Just one page. But it stayed with her longer than any war date or treaty. A man who saved lives, then lived in shadows, until someone finally saw him. His photo was printed above the chapter on veterans' rights. Not the one in uniform, not the Medal of Honor ceremony, but the one taken from a distance. Calvin sitting quietly on the courthouse bench, hands folded, eyes calm, no pose, no performance, just a man who had been through enough. Teachers used his story to talk about sacrifice, yes, but also about neglect, perseverance, and the quiet power of dignity. Students wrote essays, made posters. Some even visited the courthouse on field trips, placing hands on the bench like it might speak to them. Years had passed since Calvin Brooks had last walked this block, but his presence never really left. He had become part of the city's memory, not because he asked to be, but because the truth wouldn't let him vanish again. And now, even in stillness, he continued to teach. Not just what it meant to serve, but what it meant to endure, to be lost, to be found, and to be at last truly seen.